The afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window of the residence in Columbus, Ohio, casting long shadows across the white marble countertops. Sarah stood at her sink, washing the lunch dishes with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had done this same action 10,000 times before. Through the window, she could see the neighbor's golden retriever playing in the spring breeze, and beyond that, the quiet suburban street where she'd raised her daughter for the past 3 years. Everything about this Tuesday in March appeared ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day that dissolves into memory without leaving a trace. She had no idea that in the next few hours, her entire world would shatter into pieces that could never be reassembled. Emma, her daughter, was playing in the living room with her collection of plastic building blocks. The little girl had Sarah's dark hair and warm brown eyes, a perfect combination that made every family member smile. At 3 years old, Emma possessed that magical quality of early childhood where wonder and curiosity made even the most mundane activities entertaining. She hummed softly as she stacked blocks, creating what she called a big tower for the princess. Sarah had heard this running commentary 100 times, and it formed the background music of her daily life, the simple, beautiful soundtrack of motherhood. The unexpected knock on the door around 2 o'clock should have triggered alarm bells, but it didn't. Sarah dried her hands on a towel and headed toward the foyer, still thinking about whether she had defrosted chicken for dinner. When she opened the door, she found her brother David standing on the porch with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked tired, worn down by life in a way that Sarah recognized from their childhood, the same desperation that had plagued their father. David had always been troubled, drifting through life without direction, bouncing between jobs and cities. Sarah hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, and his sudden appearance was shocking. "I need help," David said without preamble, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had nowhere else to turn. "Everything fell apart. I lost my job, got evicted. I just need a place for a couple weeks to get back on my feet." He looked at Emma, who had wandered into the hallway, curiosity drawing her toward this stranger. "Hey there, Emma. Don't you remember Uncle David?" Emma shook her head shyly, retreating to her mother's leg. Sarah felt conflicted. She had never been comfortable around David, even as a child. He had always made her uneasy with inappropriate jokes and boundary violations, but he was still her brother, and he was clearly desperate. Against her instincts, against the whispered warning in her gut, Sarah invited him inside. She told herself that 2 weeks wouldn't hurt, that family helped family, that their parents would have wanted her to show compassion. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. For the first week, David behaved appropriately. He sat at the dinner table with Sarah and Emma. He helped with small household tasks. He stayed in the guest room and seemed genuinely grateful for the refuge. Sarah's husband of 8 years remained cautiously friendly but maintained distance, was a logical man, a software engineer who dealt in absolutes and code, right or wrong, function or malfunction. He didn't trust David, but he deferred to Sarah's judgment about family. They had no way of knowing that this tension between mercy and caution would soon become irrelevant compared to the horror heading toward them. It was who noticed the first signs of something wrong. He came home from work on the 10th day to find Emma sitting alone in her room, clutching her stuffed rabbit with unusual intensity. When he tried to pick her up and swing her around, their normal after-work ritual, Emma flinched. She actually flinched away from her father's loving hands, noticed her recoiling, saw her eyes widen with something that looked like fear. His software engineer's mind immediately began compiling data. Emma usually ran to him with excitement. Emma usually laughed at his silly voices. Emma usually wanted to be held and tossed in the air. This version of Emma was different. That evening pulled Sarah aside in their bedroom. "Something's wrong with Emma," he said quietly, closing the door. "She's acting scared. Did something happen today?" Sarah's initial reaction was dismissive. "She's probably just tired. 3-year-olds have mood swings." "This isn't a mood swing," said firmly. "This is fear." They decided to pay closer attention, to monitor Emma carefully. But they didn't suspect David. Why would they? He was family. He was a struggling man in need of help, not a predator wearing a human face. The statistics about child abuse say that most perpetrators are known to the family, but statistics feel abstract until they become your reality. 3 days later, Sarah ran to the grocery store for 30 minutes. She left Emma in the living room with David, who was watching television. Emma was safe, she thought. Emma was with family. This was normal. Parents left their children with relatives all the time. When Sarah returned, Emma was quiet, too quiet. She wasn't her usual chattering self. She was sitting on David's lap while he watched a television show, and when Sarah came through the door, Emma jumped down quickly, too quickly. David smiled casually and said Emma had been very good, very quiet. Sarah felt the first real prickle of concern, but she still didn't suspect the truth. She suggested Emma go play with her toys, and Emma with unusual obedience. Over the next 4 days, things escalated in ways so subtle that Sarah might have missed them if hadn't been watching. Emma began having accidents, reverting to behaviors she'd months ago. She developed a stutter that hadn't existed before. She started refusing to eat. She would cry if her clothes shifted in certain ways. She developed an inexplicable fear of being left alone with anyone except Sarah. The breaking point came on day 14 when Sarah was helping Emma change into her pajamas and noticed the bruises. Small, finger-shaped marks on Emma's upper arms, dark purple bruises that weren't from falling or playing. Sarah's entire body went cold. The color drained from her face. She gently asked Emma, "Did someone hurt you?" And Emma began to cry, not the frustrated tears of a toddler, but the deep, traumatized sobs of someone whose trust had been shattered. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed 911. Her voice broke between sobs as she reported the abuse. Police arrived within minutes, their uniforms filling her living room with the reality of what had happened beneath her own roof. Detective, a woman with kind but piercing eyes, asked questions that felt like accusations. David was arrested that evening as he tried to leave the house. He maintained his innocence, claiming Emma must have gotten the bruises from playing, that he would never hurt a child. But the bruises told a different story. The hospital examinations told a different story. Emma's behavior told a different story. As Sarah held her traumatized daughter in the emergency room, listening to prosecutors and detectives explain the legal process ahead, she felt the full weight of her catastrophic mistake. She had invited a wolf into her home. And now, her daughter would have to relive her trauma in a courtroom, would have to face her abuser, would have to speak words that no 3-year-old should ever have to say. The nightmare had only just begun. The first night after David's arrest, Emma didn't sleep. Sarah held her daughter through the darkness, feeling her small body trembling against her chest, listening to the whimpers and occasional panicked gasps that punctuated the silence. Every time Sarah thought Emma might be drifting off, the child would jolt awake, her body rigid with invisible terror. By 3 in the morning, Sarah found herself staring at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down her face, wondering how she could ever repair the damage that had been inflicted on her innocent baby. The following days were a blur of medical appointments and police interviews. Doctor, the pediatric trauma specialist at Columbus Children's Hospital, conducted a thorough examination of Emma. The physical injuries were limited, bruises that would fade, marks that would eventually disappear from Emma's body. But Doctor's expression told Sarah that the physical damage was insignificant compared to the psychological trauma. The doctor explained, in careful, measured tones, that Emma had experienced something that her 3-year-old brain wasn't equipped to process or understand. The violation of her body, the betrayal of someone trusted, the loss of her sense of safety. These injuries ran deeper than any visible wound. Post-traumatic stress is extremely common in young victims of abuse, Doctor explained, her voice gentle but clinical. Emma may experience nightmares, regression in development, behavioral changes, difficulty with trust. She's going to need professional support and a lot of patience from you and your family. Sarah nodded, absorbing the information like a sponge, trying desperately to retain every word as if understanding would somehow give her power over the situation. But power was the one thing she didn't have. She couldn't erase what happened. She couldn't restore her daughter's innocence. She couldn't undo her catastrophic mistake of letting David into their home. That first week, Emma began her regression into silence. She stopped speaking spontaneously, responding only to direct questions with single-word answers, whispered so quietly that people had to lean in to hear her. The vibrant chatter that had characterized her personality, the running commentary about princesses and dragons and what clouds were made of, simply vanished. It was as if Emma had retreated into some internal fortress, pulling all her words behind protective walls where no one could reach them. The nightmare started without warning. Emma would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, her small body drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with terror at visions only she could see. Sarah would rush into her room and hold her, whispering reassurances that felt hollow and powerless. "Mommy's here. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you." But Emma would shake her head frantically, her breath coming in panicked gasps, clearly unconvinced by her mother's promises. How could Emma feel safe when the people supposed to protect her had failed so spectacularly? Watched his daughter's transformation with the helplessness of a man used to solving problems through logic and reason. He spent hours online researching child trauma, reading clinical papers, watching videos of specialists discussing recovery. He threw himself into work, often staying late at the office because at least there he could solve problems, fix code, create solutions. But he couldn't fix this. Nobody could fix this. 2 weeks after the arrest, Sarah noticed Emma having accidents. Her potty training, which had been complete for 6 months, suddenly reversed. Emma would wet herself without seeming to notice or care, staring blankly at nothing. Doctor explained this was common. Young children often regress in response to trauma, reverting to earlier developmental stages. It was their way of seeking comfort from when they felt safer. The stutter appeared around day 16. Emma would start to say something, open her mouth, and then the words would get stuck, repeating over and over, Mommy, CCC, can I have?" She would get frustrated, her face flushing with effort, and then she would simply stop trying. Sarah's heart would break a little more each time it happened. Food became another casualty of Emma's trauma. The little girl who had enthusiastically devoured chicken nuggets and fruit now pushed her plate away after a few bites. She would sit at the dinner table, staring at her food with disinterest, sometimes becoming nauseated at the smell. Sarah watched her daughter grow thinner, watched her energy drain away, watched vitality leak out of her like air from a punctured balloon. By day 21, Sarah was running on fumes. She had missed 2 weeks of work at the marketing firm where she was a senior manager, was doing his best to hold down his job while managing the crisis at home. They hadn't argued directly, but Sarah felt the tension between them growing, the tension of 2 people drowning and unsure whether they'd have strength enough to save each other. The prosecutor, Diana Foster, called with updates about the case. Diana was a woman in her late 40s with silver streaking her dark hair and a reputation for aggressive prosecution of child abuse cases. She had devoted her career to fighting for victims who couldn't fight for themselves. During their phone call, Diana's voice carried a note of frustration that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Diana said bluntly. "Without Emma's testimony, our case is significantly weakened. David's defense team is already filing motions, claiming insufficient evidence. They'll argue the bruises could have come from rough play, that Emma is too young and too traumatized to be a reliable witness, that we're coaching her into false memories. Without her voice in that courtroom speaking about what happened, he could walk." Sarah felt the floor shifting beneath her feet. "But she's 3 years old. She's traumatized. You can't expect her to testify." "I know," Diana said, and Sarah could hear genuine pain in her voice. "But the law requires witness testimony in most cases. Without it, the defense will tear apart everything else we have. I'm not saying this to pressure you. I'm saying it because you need to understand what we're facing. We have time before trial, maybe months. Maybe Emma will heal enough to speak." That night after fell asleep, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and began researching. She searched "Help Traumatized Children Speak," "Child Abuse Recovery," "Therapy Options for Toddlers." At 2 a.m., exhausted and desperate, she typed "Therapy Dogs for Child Abuse Victims" into the search bar. The results that appeared would change everything. She found articles about court-certified therapy dogs, programs where specially trained animals help traumatized children communicate and find courage. She read stories of other survivors who had found their voices through connection with animals. She discovered that there were dogs who could sit beside a child in a courtroom, animals who had training and certifications, dogs who understood trauma in ways that humans sometimes couldn't. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a fragile, tentative spark of hope. Maybe there was a way. Maybe Emma didn't have to face the courtroom alone. Maybe there was something that could bridge the impossible gap between her daughter's silence and justice. The next morning, exhausted but driven by renewed purpose, Sarah called Diana Foster. "I found something," she said. "Therapy dogs, have you heard of them?" Diana's response was immediate and engaged. "Yes, actually, and I've been thinking about it. Let me investigate. This might just be what Emma needs." For the first time since the nightmare began, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The Columbus Police Department's K-9 unit was located in a modern facility on the east side of the city, housed in a building that blended contemporary architecture with practical functionality. When Diana Foster called Sarah with the contact information for Officer James Mitchell, she spoke with genuine enthusiasm, something Sarah hadn't heard from the prosecutor in weeks. "Officer Mitchell is exceptional," Diana explained over the phone. "He's been working with for 7 years. The dog has helped dozens of child witnesses. Mitchell is compassionate, professional, and completely committed to this work. If anyone can help Emma, it's them." Sarah scheduled the appointment for the following Saturday morning, wanting to give Emma the full weekend to recover if the experience proved too overwhelming. She didn't explain to Emma where they were going or why. How do you explain to a traumatized 3-year-old that you're taking her to meet a police dog? Instead, she simply told Emma they were going on an adventure, keeping her voice light and casual, hiding the trembling anxiety beneath. Drove while Sarah sat in the back seat with Emma, who stared out the window with the vacant expression that had become her default setting. Sarah held her daughter's small hand, feeling the tension in those tiny fingers, wishing she could transmit confidence and safety through touch alone. The drive felt simultaneously too short and impossibly long, each minute weighted with the significance of this moment. Officer James Mitchell stood outside the K-9 facility when they arrived, and Sarah's first impression was one of quiet competence. He was a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and gray threading through his dark hair. He wore the uniform of the Columbus Police Department with the ease of someone who had dedicated his life to service. But it was the German Shepherd beside him that captured everyone's attention. Was magnificent. The 4-year-old dog stood at perfect attention, his coat a rich mahogany brown with black saddle markings. His ears were alert, his dark eyes intelligent and aware. There was something almost noble about his bearing, a presence that conveyed both strength and gentleness. Sarah found herself thinking that this dog looked like he understood gravity and purpose in ways that most humans didn't. "Welcome," Officer Mitchell said, his voice warm and measured. He's been looking forward to meeting you." He said this last part directly to Emma, lowering himself slightly to make eye contact with the small girl. "Would you like to say hello?" Emma didn't respond verbally. She never did anymore. But she leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on his face. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with the kind of intuitive understanding that separates extraordinary animals from ordinary ones, took a single step forward and sat down directly in front of Emma. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He simply sat, his tail resting still against the ground, his eyes meeting Emma's with what could only be described as recognition. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Emma's entire body language shifted. The tension that constantly gripped her shoulders seemed to ease slightly. She released her mother's hand and took one tentative step forward. Officer Mitchell remained perfectly still, understanding the delicate nature of this moment. Seconds stretched into what felt like eternity as Emma and regarded each other, two trauma survivors silently acknowledging something that words couldn't convey. Then Emma reached out, her small hand trembling slightly, and touched fur. The tears came without warning, not the frustrated cries or the terrified sobs that had characterized Emma's emotional releases over the past 3 weeks, but something deeper and more genuine. Her whole body shook as she pressed her forehead against his chest, her fingers gripping his fur like it was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Remained perfectly still, as if understanding that this moment required his complete stillness and presence. Officer Mitchell stepped back slightly, giving them space, and when Sarah looked at him, she saw tears in his eyes as well. "This is exactly what I hoped would happen," he said quietly. "Recognizes pain, he responds to it. Your daughter has found a real friend." For the next hour, Officer Mitchell explains background and training. Had been selected as a puppy from a specialized breeding program because of his temperament, intelligent, calm, deeply empathetic. He had 18 months of intensive training, learning to respond to traumatized children with exactly the kind of gentle presence that Emma needed. He was certified by the court system and had, in the sense of his presence being part of testimony, in 43 child abuse cases. "What's remarkable about," Officer Mitchell explained, "is that he doesn't judge. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't show shock or horror at what children tell him. For traumatized kids, that's incredibly important. The adults in their lives are often reacting with their own emotions, anger, guilt, sadness, just listens. He just exists. That's his gift." As they talked, Emma remained close to, occasionally running her fingers through his fur, watching his face with an intensity of focus that had been absent from her expression for weeks. It was as if it activated something in her, some small spark of trust that had been extinguished by David's violation. "Can we come back?" Sarah asked, hearing the desperate hope in her own voice. "Absolutely," Officer Mitchell said. "I'd recommend 3 times a week if that works with your schedule. We'll let Emma and develop their relationship gradually. Sometimes children need several visits before they start opening up. The important thing is consistency and allowing the process to happen naturally." As they drove home, Emma actually spoke for the first time in days. Not in full sentences, but in fragments. "Dog nice, dog safe, good." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her daughter's halting words. It wasn't much, barely the beginning of communication, but it represented something miraculous. The first crack in the wall of silence that trauma had built around Emma's voice. That night, Sarah called Diana Foster to report the meeting. The prosecutor listened intently, asking questions about certification, Officer Mitchell's experience, and Emma's reaction. "This is good," Diana said finally. "This is really good. If we can help Emma build trust with and then bring him into the courtroom during her testimony, we might have a real chance. Not just at conviction, but at helping Emma reclaim her voice. You found exactly what we needed." Over the following weeks, the pattern became clear. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning, the family drove to the police station. Emma would run to the K-9 unit with a speed and purpose that she hadn't shown since before the abuse. Officer Mitchell would bring out, and the two would reunite as if they hadn't seen each other in years rather than just a few days. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, Emma began to change. She started talking not to her parents but to the dog. She would whisper things into his ear, tell him about her nightmares, share her fears. Officer Mitchell documented everything carefully, understanding that this was the crucial bridge between Emma's trauma and her eventual testimony. One afternoon, 6 weeks after their first meeting, Emma looked up at Officer Mitchell and said clearly, "Will help me be brave." Officer Mitchell knelt down and met her eyes. "Yes, he will. Is the bravest dog I know, and he believes in you." In that moment, something shifted fundamentally. Emma had begun to understand that she wasn't alone. She had an ally, a companion, a guardian whose presence could transform her fear into courage. The wall of silence wasn't gone. It would take much more to dismantle it completely, but a door had opened. Light had found its way inside. And through that opening, hope began to grow. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like watching a photograph develop in chemical solution. Week by week, Emma became incrementally more herself, or perhaps more accurately, she began discovering who she could become beyond the trauma. Sarah noticed it in small moments that accumulated into something undeniable, the reappearance of her daughter's spirit. 3 weeks into the regular visits with, Emma asked for food without being prompted. It was a simple request, "Can I have crackers?" but it represented a fundamental shift. She was beginning to believe that her body deserved nourishment, that she had a right to exist in the world without flinching. Sarah prepared cheese and crackers and sat with her daughter, watching her nibble at the food with something approaching genuine appetite. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The nightmares began to decrease in frequency and intensity. Where Emma had been waking up screaming 3 or 4 times each night, now it happened perhaps once. Sarah, who had been running on fumes and coffee for weeks, found herself sleeping for 3 consecutive hours without interruption, a luxury that felt almost sinful in its restorative power. She would wake up guilt-ridden, feeling as if she shouldn't be resting while her daughter suffered, but gently reminded her that she couldn't help Emma if she collapsed from exhaustion. Dr. Emma's pediatric trauma specialist, incorporated into Emma's formal therapy sessions. She would meet with Emma and Officer Mitchell in a specially designed therapy room at the hospital, a space decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture, deliberately unlike any clinical or intimidating environment. During these sessions, Emma would sit beside while Doctor used play therapy techniques to help her process the trauma. "Can you show me with the dolls what happened?" Doctor would ask gently, gesturing to a collection of age-appropriate dolls and props. Emma would remain silent, stroking his fur, gathering courage from his presence. Then slowly, haltingly, she would move the dolls, recreating scenes and situations that her verbal vocabulary couldn't yet express. Would watch her work, occasionally turning his head to look at her face, as if offering encouragement through his attention alone. Doctor explained to Sarah and that this process was crucial. Emma is learning that she can talk about what happened, through play, through action, through her presence without being. She's rebuilding her sense of agency. In the beginning, David took her agency away. Now, through this process, she's reclaiming it. 4 weeks into the therapy work, something remarkable happened. Emma was sitting with Officer Mitchell and in the police station's K-9 facility, the space that had become her sanctuary. She looked up at Officer Mitchell and asked, "Why did Uncle David hurt me?" Officer Mitchell had been trained for this moment, but the rawness of the question still affected him deeply. He sat down beside Emma, his movements slow and deliberate. "Uncle David made bad choices," he said carefully. "What he did was wrong. None of it was your fault. You didn't do anything to cause it. You are not responsible for his bad choices." Emma processed this information, her small face serious and contemplative. Then she asked, "Will he hurt me again?" "No," Officer Mitchell said with absolute certainty. "He's in jail. He can't hurt you. And when we go to court, you're going to tell people what happened, and the judge and jury are going to make sure he stays in jail for a very long time. We'll be there with you. I'll be there. Your mommy and daddy will be there. You won't be alone." Emma looked at, then back at Officer Mitchell. "Is brave." "Is the bravest dog I know," Officer Mitchell confirmed. "Then I be brave too," Emma said, with a determination that seemed too large for her small body to contain. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from Officer Mitchell describing the conversation. She pulled over to the side of the road and cried, not tears of sadness this time, but tears of something approaching hope. By week 6 of working with, Emma's speech had improved dramatically. She still had moments of selective muteness, particularly when she was overwhelmed or frightened, but the stutter had nearly disappeared. More importantly, she was beginning to speak in fuller sentences, to express complex thoughts and feelings. She was, bit by bit, finding her voice. Sarah noticed Emma speaking too about things she wouldn't tell adults. "I scared," Emma would whisper into his fur. "I feel bad inside. Why did he do it?" Officer Mitchell encouraged this process, understanding that Emma was using as a safe receptacle for her darkest thoughts and fears. Never flinched, never became frustrated or overwhelmed. Simply listened, his steady presence a constant reassurance that it was safe to express pain. The prosecutor, Diana Foster, began preparing Emma for courtroom testimony with unusual methods. Instead of the traditional interview room, Diana would meet with Emma in Officer Mitchell's office at the police station, with present. Diana explained, in age-appropriate language, what would happen in court. "There's a big room with a judge, like a very important person who makes decisions," Diana explained. "And there will be people sitting in chairs. Those are jurors, and they need to hear your story. Some of these people might be Uncle David's helpers, and they might ask you questions to try to confuse you. But you just tell the truth. That's all you have to do." "Come with me," Emma asked anxiously. "We'll be right beside you," Diana promised. "And I'll be there. Officer Mitchell will be there. Your mommy will be able to see you." Emma nodded, processing this information. With each conversation, with each explanation, with each moment of preparation, Emma was building mental architecture to contain and manage what she would soon be asked to do. 8 weeks into the therapy process, Sarah noticed that Emma had stopped flinching when her clothes shifted or when she was being dressed. The hypervigilance that had characterized her trauma response, that constant state of anticipating pain and danger, was beginning to fade. She was learning, through consistent safety and through unwavering presence, that the world could be trusted again. One afternoon, Emma asked to go to school. She hadn't attended preschool since the trauma, and Sarah had worried that she might never want to return to that environment. But Emma seemed ready. On her first day back, she brought a drawing she had made, a picture of herself and together, with the sun shining above them. "My friend," she told her preschool teacher, "help me be brave." The teacher, aware of Emma's situation, smiled with genuine warmth. "I can see that. You look very brave." The nightmares had nearly ceased entirely. Emma was eating regular meals. She was sleeping through the night. She was playing with other children, laughing, actually laughing, at age-appropriate jokes and silly moments. She was becoming what she should have always been, a normal, resilient, joyful 3-year-old child. But beneath this recovery was something more profound happening. Emma was gathering strength. She was building courage. She was preparing, with the help of a remarkable dog and a network of compassionate adults, for the most difficult thing she would ever have to do. The trial was now 8 weeks away. During one of her final sessions with Doctor before the courtroom testimony, Emma drew a picture of a small girl standing beside a large dog, and above them, written in adult handwriting at Emma's instruction, were the words, "Help me find my brave." Doctor looked at this image and knew that Emma was ready. Not because she was healed, healing would take years, but because she had found something more powerful than fear. She had found connection, trust, and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. The wall of silence was crumbling, and through the cracks, Emma's voice was beginning to emerge, stronger with each passing day. March 15th arrived with the kind of cold Ohio spring weather that felt like nature itself was holding its breath. The morning started before dawn for the family. Sarah woke at 4:47 a.m., unable to sleep any longer, her mind already racing with 1,000 anxieties. She found already awake in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee sitting on the counter, steam rising from their surfaces. They looked at each other without speaking, communicating through exhausted eyes and the weight of what was about to happen. Emma slept until 7 o'clock, and when she woke, she seemed to sense the extraordinary nature of the day. She didn't ask questions, but she moved through the morning with unusual quietness, as if she understood in the way that children sometimes do that today was different. Sarah dressed her in the pink dress they had selected weeks ago, not too formal, not too casual, chosen specifically to make Emma look like what she was, an innocent child rather than a prosecutorial weapon. They arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, and Sarah was shocked by the scene that greeted them. News vans were parked along the street, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Reporters clustered near the courthouse entrance, their cameras ready, their predatory instincts awakened by the promise of a compelling story. Child abuse, family betrayal, the question of whether a 3-year-old could credibly testify. Officer Mitchell was waiting for them in a private entrance at the back of the courthouse, beside him, already wearing his official vest that identified him as a court-certified therapy animal. When Emma saw, her entire body visibly relaxed. She reached down and wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. "We've got this," Officer Mitchell said quietly to Sarah, and though they all knew it was a statement of hope rather than certainty. Inside the courthouse, Diana Foster was waiting in her office, reviewing her notes for what felt like the 1,000th time. She had prosecuted 43 child abuse cases in her career, but this one felt different. This one was personal in a way that professional ethics usually prevented. She had spent countless hours with Emma, had watched the little girl gather courage week after week, had seen the transformation that had catalyzed. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. "How's she doing?" Diana asked when Sarah entered with Emma and Officer Mitchell. "Scared," Sarah admitted, "but ready." Diana knelt down to Emma's level, her experienced eyes assessing the child's emotional state with practiced precision. "Emma, do you remember what I told you about today?" Emma nodded, her hand gripping his collar like it was a lifeline. "You're going to sit in a special chair," Diana continued, "and you're going to tell the truth about what happened. We'll be right there with you. If you need to take a break, you just tell the judge, okay? There's no rush. We have all the time you need." David's defense team was already in the courthouse, preparing their own strategy. Attorney Richard Caldwell was a man in his early 60s with a reputation for aggressive tactics and a conviction rate that suggested he knew how to manipulate juries. He had reviewed the case file thoroughly and understood his challenge. A prosecution dependent almost entirely on the testimony of a traumatized 3-year-old child with a history of selective muteness. It was a vulnerability he intended to exploit ruthlessly. When Emma, Sarah, and Officer Mitchell entered the courtroom, the energy shifted dramatically. The gallery, packed with journalists, court observers, and supporters of the family, seemed to collectively hold its breath. Judge, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for fairness and firmness, sat elevated on the bench, her eyes taking in the scene with judicial assessment. Caldwell immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I must object to the presence of the dog in this proceeding. This is highly prejudicial. The jury will be emotionally manipulated by the presence of an animal, their objectivity compromised by sympathy rather than evidence." "The dog is court-certified," Diana countered, her voice steady and professional. "It serves a therapeutic function for the witness. There is ample case law supporting the admissibility of such animals when they provide legitimate assistance to traumatized witnesses." Judge considered both arguments with the deliberate patience of someone accustomed to weighing life-altering decisions. "The dog stays," she ruled finally. "The witness has been evaluated by doctor, the animal is properly certified, and its presence serves a legitimate therapeutic purpose that does not constitute prejudicial conduct. Counsel, you may proceed with your cross-examination as you see fit, but the dog remains. Caldwell's face darkened, but he nodded his acceptance of the ruling. Emma was sworn in using an age-appropriate oath. She placed her small hand on a children's Bible and repeated after the court clerk, her voice barely audible, "I promise to tell the truth." The prosecutor's direct examination began with gentle questions designed to establish Emma's basic and memory. What was her name? How old was she? What was her favorite color? Slowly, deliberately, Diana built a foundation of reliability, demonstrating to the jury that this small child could form memories and communicate them accurately. Then the questions became more specific. "Emma, do you remember when Uncle David came to stay at your house?" "Yes," Emma whispered, her hand finding fur. "Can you tell me what happened?" What followed was a halting, fragmented narrative delivered by a 3-year-old whose vocabulary was sometimes inadequate to describe her experience. But the essential truth emerged. David had hurt her. He had touched her in ways that made her feel bad. He told her not to tell. She was scared. With each answer, the courtroom grew quieter, the weight of her testimony settling over everyone present like a heavy fog. Some jurors had tears streaming down their faces. Others looked at David with expressions that suggested they were imagining what they would do if this was their child. Then Caldwell stood up for cross-examination, and the atmosphere changed. "Ms.," he began, using formal language deliberately to distance himself from the child, "isn't it true that you've been coached by your mother to say these things?" "No," Emma said quietly. "And isn't it true that you've been spending a lot of time with this dog, and the dog's presence is making you say things that didn't really happen?" Diana stood up immediately. "Objection. That's argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence." "Sustained," Judge ruled. Caldwell pressed on, his questions becoming increasingly complex and confusing, designed to trip up a child who was already operating at the very edge of her emotional capacity. Emma's answers became less certain. She started looking down at rather than at the attorney. Her voice became even quieter. Sarah sat in the gallery, every muscle in her body tense, watching her daughter being subjected to an interrogation that no 3-year-old should ever have to endure. Gripped her hand so tightly she lost feeling in her fingers. Then something happened that would alter the trajectory of the entire trial. Emma looked at and looked back at her. The dog, seemingly understanding that his charge was under siege, stood up slightly and pressed his full body against Emma's leg. Emma placed her small hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, that same steady rhythm she had discovered in their first meeting at the police station. Caldwell continued his attack. "And you're just making this up, aren't you? You want attention from your mother, so you're—" "No," Emma said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. "I'm not making it up. Uncle David hurt me. He touched me bad. I told you, I'm not lying." The courtroom went completely silent. This wasn't the frightened whisper they had heard during Diana's direct examination. This was a child speaking truth with the kind of clarity that transcends age and articulation. This was a little girl who had finally found her voice, amplified by her connection to the dog beside her. Caldwell, thrown off balance by the sudden shift in Emma's demeanor, fumbled with his next question. "Did the dog tell you to say that?" "Dogs don't talk," Emma said with the kind of simple logic that only a child could deliver. "Just help me be brave. He my friend, and I tell truth about Uncle David." Diana couldn't suppress a smile. The jury members were openly emotional now. Even Judge appeared moved by the child's extraordinary testimony. Caldwell sat down, realizing he had lost this battle decisively. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, she looked exhausted but triumphant. Pressed against her side, and Officer Mitchell led them out of the courtroom. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her, feeling the weight of what Emma had just accomplished. They had won. Not legally yet, not officially. But in that moment in that courtroom, A 3-year-old girl and a police dog had spoken truth to power, and the power had no adequate response. The jury would take 3 hours to deliberate before returning with their verdict. 3 hours that would feel like an eternity. The recess lasted exactly 14 minutes. Sarah used those 14 minutes to hold Emma in a quiet room adjacent to the courtroom, the little girl trembling against her mother's chest, emotionally depleted from the intensity of the cross-examination. Officer Mitchell stood in the doorway speaking quietly to about what would come next if Diana decided to continue with questions to rehabilitate Emma's testimony after Caldwell's aggressive attack. "She did remarkably well," Officer Mitchell said, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. "Most children would have completely shut down under that kind of pressure. Emma found her courage when she needed it most." Diana appeared at the doorway, her expression serious but not defeated. "We need to do one more round," she said quietly to Sarah. "Just a few questions to reinforce her credibility and let the jury see her strength one more time. Then she's done testifying. She's finished." Sarah looked at Emma, whose dark eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "Can you do this, baby? Just a little bit more." Emma nodded slowly, her hand reaching out to Stroke's head as the dog stepped into the room. It was as if Emma understood, even at her tender age, that would give her what she needed: unconditional support, judgment-free presence, and the physical reminder that she was not alone. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge instructed Diana to proceed. The prosecutor stood, her notes in front of her, but she didn't look at them. Instead, she looked directly at Emma. "Emma, I want to ask you a few more questions if that's okay. Is it okay?" "Yes," Emma said, her voice still small but carrying more confidence than before. "You've been very brave today," Diana said, and the words were genuine, not patronizing. "Can you tell the jury what it means to be brave?" Emma thought about this question with the seriousness of someone who had recently discovered what bravery actually meant. Brave is when you're scared, but you tell the truth anyway. Brave is when you hurt inside, but you keep going. Brave is, she paused, looking down at, brave is having a friend who help you. Several jurors were openly weeping now. One older man in the back row had his hand pressed to his chest, as if physically containing his emotion. "And Emma, when you look at, what do you feel?" "Safe," Emma said immediately. "I feel safe, and I feel brave. Help me find my brave." Diana nodded, understanding that this moment had transcended the legal necessities of the trial. This had become something more profound, a testimony not just to what David had done, but to what Emma had become through the support and connection she had found. "I don't have any more questions," Diana said quietly, and she returned to her seat. Judge looked at Caldwell. "Do you have any further questions for this witness?" Caldwell looked at Emma, then at the jury, and he seemed to make a calculation. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said simply, "No further questions, Your Honor." It was a calculated retreat by a seasoned attorney who understood that continued assault on this child would only damage his client's case further. The jury had already made up their minds, and no amount of aggressive questioning would change that. Emma was excused from the witness stand. Officer Mitchell met her at the edge of the witness box and knelt down, and Emma collapsed into his arms, her body shaking with the release of tension she had been holding. Pressed against her side, his presence a physical anchor to safety and support. As they exited the courtroom, the gallery erupted. Judge gavelled sharply. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if there are any further outbursts." But the emotion in that room was palpable, undeniable. What everyone had witnessed was extraordinary. The prosecution called 2 more witnesses: the pediatrician who had documented Emma's injuries, and Dr. who about the psychological trauma consistent with child abuse. But everyone in the courtroom understood that the case had already been decided in the moment when Emma found her voice and spoke her truth. When David was called to the stand by his own defense team, he maintained his innocence, claiming that Emma had misunderstood normal interactions, that her accusations were a result of coaching and manipulation. His testimony was wooden, unconvincing, lacking the emotional authenticity that Emma's simple statements had possessed. He refused to make eye contact with anyone in the courtroom, and his hands shook as he answered questions. Closing arguments came in the late afternoon. Diana stood before the jury and spoke with measured eloquence about the courage of a child, about the consistency of Emma's testimony, about the physical evidence that corroborated her account. She spoke about trauma and how it manifests, about the remarkable gift of presence in helping Emma find her voice. "This case comes down to one fundamental question," Diana said, her voice carrying through the quiet courtroom. "Do you believe a 3-year-old child who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking? Or do you believe a man who has a clear motivation to deny his crimes? The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is clear. Justice demands that we believe Emma." Caldwell's closing argument tried to sow reasonable doubt, to suggest that the therapy dog had somehow tainted Emma's testimony, to argue that a child of that age was inherently unreliable. But his words fell flat against the weight of what the jury had witnessed. Judge gave her instructions to the jury at 4:47 p.m. on March 15th. She explained the legal standard they had to meet, the charges they were considering, and the gravity of their responsibility. At 5:03 p.m., the jury was escorted to the deliberation room. The family was taken to a private waiting area. Sarah held Emma, who had finally fallen asleep from the exhaustion of the day. Sat beside them, his arm around both of them, his expression a mixture of hope and terror. Officer Mitchell remained with them, his presence somehow making the waiting more bearable. Diana came in periodically to update them. "The jury is asking for a transcript of Emma's testimony," she reported at 6:15 p.m., and her voice carried a note of cautious optimism. "That's a good sign. They're taking this seriously." At 8:42 p.m., a bailiff appeared at the door. "The jury has reached a verdict," she said. The courtroom was crowded again, every seat filled, reporters packed into every available space. Emma sat between her parents at her feet, the dog's presence somehow making the moment bearable. David sat at the defense table, his face ashen, as if he already knew what was coming. Judge entered and sat at the bench. The jury filed back into the courtroom, and Sarah studied their faces, trying to read the verdict in their expressions. They looked somber, determined, resolved. "Madam Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes, responded. "On the charge of child abuse, how do you find?" "Guilty," the foreman said clearly. Emma's small hand grips fur. "On the charge of endangering a child, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of sexual abuse of a minor, how do you find?" "Guilty." The words continued, a litany of guilty verdicts, each one a validation of Emma's courage, each one a consequence of David's violation. 12 guilty verdicts in total, unanimous, undeniable. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, buried his face in his hands. Officer Mitchell placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. When Emma looked up the dog licked her face gently, as if offering congratulations and comfort simultaneously. "I did it," Emma whispered. "I told the truth." "You did," Officer Mitchell confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "You were so brave." In that moment, in that courtroom, a 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd had fundamentally changed the trajectory of a case, transformed a legal proceeding, and demonstrated to everyone present the extraordinary power of a child's voice when supported by unconditional love and connection. The silence that fell over the courtroom wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of respect, of witnessing something truly sacred, a child speaking truth to power and that truth prevailing. Justice, in its most authentic form, had been served. Sentencing took place 3 weeks after the guilty verdict. on a warm spring morning that felt almost too beautiful for such a serious occasion. The courtroom was less packed this time. The media had gotten their story. The legal outcome was decided, and most observers had moved on to the next tragedy demanding their attention. But for the family, this moment was anything but anticlimactic. This was the moment when consequences became concrete, when Emma's testimony translated into actual accountability. Judge entered the courtroom with the same measured authority she had demonstrated throughout the trial. David was led in by bailiffs, his orange prison jumpsuit a stark reminder that his freedom was already over, even before the judge spoke. He looked diminished somehow, as if the weight of his actions had physically compressed him into something smaller and less human. "David," Judge began, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "you have been found guilty on 12 counts of child abuse and endangering a child. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to make something absolutely clear. This verdict is based entirely on the testimony and credibility of a child who had every reason to remain silent, who had every reason to protect her abuser, but who found the courage to speak truth. That 3-year-old girl demonstrated more moral clarity and bravery than you have shown in your entire life." Sarah watched from the gallery, Emma beside her, the little girl's hand gripping her mother's fingers. Officer Mitchell sat directly behind them and the dog's presence seemed to ground them all in something solid and real. Judge continued, "I am sentencing you to 12 years in the Ohio correctional system, with eligibility for parole only after serving a minimum of 8 years. You will receive counseling for your behavioral issues, and you will be required to register as a sex offender for the remainder of your life. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the extraordinary trauma you inflicted on a vulnerable child." The gavel struck and it was finished. David was led away and Emma watched him go without emotion. She had said everything she needed to say. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to happen within the family. Not the instantaneous healing that media narratives sometimes suggest, but something slower, more genuine, more real. Emma continued her weekly sessions with doctor and her twice-weekly visits but now these weren't crisis interventions. They were the continuation of healing that had already begun. Emma returned to preschool with new confidence. She made friends. She laughed easily. She started telling stories and jokes. She drew pictures of and showed them to everyone she met. She began to understand in her own child's way that she had survived something terrible and come out the other side. But more importantly, Emma started to understand the concept of helping others. One afternoon, as she played with at the police station, Officer Mitchell introduced her to another little girl, age 4, who had also experienced abuse and was beginning her own therapy journey. "Emma, this is Sophie," Officer Mitchell said gently. "Sophie is scared, kind of like you were. Can you tell her about?" Emma looked at Sophie with the kind of wisdom that only comes from having walked through darkness and emerged into light. "Help you be brave," Emma told the other girl. "My friend, help me tell truth. Help me not be scared." Sophie, with her own traumas and fears, reached out hesitantly and touched fur. The dog, with his infinite patience and understanding, sat perfectly still, offering his presence as a healing salve. Sarah, watching from across the room, felt tears of a different quality, not tears of grief or guilt, but tears recognizing that her daughter's suffering was somehow being transformed into something that could help others. Emma was becoming not just a survivor, but a healer. 3 months after the verdict, Sarah received a call from Diana Foster. The prosecutor's voice carried excitement that Sarah hadn't heard before. "I've been contacted by the Ohio Department of Justice," Diana said. "They want to create a statewide initiative to expand the therapy dog program in courthouses across Ohio. They want to use your case, with your permission, as the foundation for this expansion. They're asking me to lead the program, and I'd like to include Officer Mitchell and as the primary training model." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition that Emma's ordeal, while never acceptable, never justified, was being channeled into something that could protect other children. Emma would want that, she said quietly. Within 18 months of Emma's testimony, every county courthouse in Ohio had access to a court-certified therapy dog. Officers and dogs underwent specialized training based on its model. Other states took notice. California, Texas, New York, Florida. States began implementing similar programs. Professional organizations published guidelines and best practices. Law enforcement agencies competed to develop their own K-9 therapy units. Diana Foster became a nationally recognized expert on trauma-informed prosecution. She traveled to conferences, spoke before legislative committees, and trained prosecutors across the country on how to support traumatized child witnesses. She kept Emma's case file on her desk as a daily reminder of why this work mattered. Officer Mitchell was promoted to head a new specialized division within the Columbus Police Department dedicated entirely to K-9 therapy and victim support. His training protocols became the gold standard that other departments adopted. He worked with Emma and whenever possible, recognizing that their partnership represented something extraordinary, a living, breathing model of human-animal connection healing trauma. But perhaps the most significant transformation happened within the family itself. Who had thrown himself into work as a way of managing crisis, found a new sense of purpose. He began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that supported families affected by child abuse. His software engineering skills proved invaluable in helping the organization develop better tracking and support systems for victims. He discovered that crisis, while devastating, could also reveal unexpected reserves of compassion and strength within himself. Sarah took a sabbatical from her marketing job and eventually transitioned to work as a trauma-informed consultant for schools and organizations serving children. She developed training programs on recognizing signs of abuse and creating safe environments for disclosure. She became an advocate not just for Emma, but for all silenced children. And Emma, at age 5 and then 6 and 7, grew into a child who understood resilience in a way that most adults never would. She didn't suppress her trauma or pretend it didn't happen. Instead, she integrated it into her understanding of herself and the world. She was brave, but she was also allowed to be scared sometimes. She was a survivor, but she was also just a normal kid who liked ice cream and cartoons and playing tag. Every Saturday without fail, the family visited at the police station. Emma would read books to him, braid ribbons into his fur, and sit beside him in comfortable silence that had become the language of their friendship. Officer Mitchell would always greet them with warmth, and would always seem to light up at Emma's arrival, as if recognizing something sacred in their bond. One afternoon, during a routine visit about 18 months after the verdict, Emma turned to Officer Mitchell and asked a question that seemed to contain the wisdom of someone far older than her years. How many other kids did help? Many, Officer Mitchell said, looking at the German shepherd with genuine affection. Dozens and dozens, and all because of you, Emma. You helped become even more important. Your courage showed people that dogs could change the world. Emma considered this information seriously, then looked at and said, "Good job, we both did good job." The dog licked her face, and in that simple gesture of affection lay the entire story. The trauma, the healing, the connection, the transformation, the systemic change. All of it started with a 3-year-old girl who was too scared to speak, who found courage in an unexpected source, and who spoke truth that changed everything. The nightmare had become a beacon. The silence had become a voice that echoed across an entire state and beyond. And the little girl who had almost been lost to trauma was found. Not just found, but transformed into something remarkable. A child who understood that speaking truth matters, that connection heals, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else help you find your brave. 5 years after Emma's testimony, the state of Ohio hosted a ceremonial recognition of the therapy dog program's achievement and impact. It was held on a crisp fall morning at the Columbus Convention Center, with representatives from law enforcement agencies, child advocacy organizations, legal professionals, and media outlets in attendance. The event had been organized to celebrate the expansion of the program, to recognize Officer Mitchell's pioneering work, and to honor the child whose courage had catalyzed it all. 8-year-old Emma stood backstage with her parents, wearing a simple blue dress that Sarah had carefully selected, nothing too formal, nothing designed to perform or manipulate. Emma was tall for her age, with her mother's dark hair and her father's thoughtful eyes. She carried herself with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who had survived something difficult and emerged whole. "Are you nervous?" asked gently, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "A little bit," Emma admitted, "but we'll be there, right?" "We'll be right beside you," Officer Mitchell confirmed, appearing from backstage with the German Shepherd on a formal leash. At 11 years old was beginning to show his age. His muzzle was graying, his movements slightly less fluid than they once were, but his eyes remained sharp and intelligent, still carrying that quality of understanding that had first captivated Emma so many years ago. The auditorium was packed with over 300 people. News cameras lined the back wall. Sarah squeezed Emma's hand as they walked out onto the stage, Officer Mitchell and beside them. Diana Foster was already on stage, along with Dr., the pediatric trauma specialist who had guided Emma's healing. The mayor of Columbus was there, along with the director of the Ohio Department of Justice. The first part of the ceremony featured speakers discussing the program's impact. Statistics were presented. Over 240 child witnesses in Ohio had been supported by therapy dogs during testimony. The conviction rate in child abuse cases had increased by 38% since the program's implementation. Other states had adopted similar models, and now more than 20 states had court-certified therapy dog programs. "This program exists," the director of the Ohio Department of Justice said, "because one child found her voice, because she was brave enough to speak truth, and because we as a system were willing to listen and to adapt." Then it was Diana Foster's turn to speak. The prosecutor stood at the microphone, her expression reflecting the deep regard she held for the child whose case had changed her career trajectory. "5 years ago," Diana began, "I stood in front of a jury and asked them to believe a 3-year-old girl. Not because of sophisticated legal arguments, not because of physical evidence alone, but because of her truth. What I witnessed in Emma's testimony was the power of a child's voice when that voice is supported, believed, and protected. And I witnessed the extraordinary gift of a dog who understood trauma in ways that we, as adults, often struggle to comprehend." Diana looked directly at Emma. "Emma, you changed the system, not just for yourself but for hundreds of other children who will now have the support you had. Your courage is a gift that keeps giving." Then Officer Mitchell approached the microphone at his side. He was a man who had spent his entire career in law enforcement, a man accustomed to maintaining professional distance. But as he began to speak, his voice carried emotion that he made no effort to conceal. "Has served the Columbus Police Department and the people of Ohio for 11 years, he said. But his most important work wasn't with criminals or in police operations. His most important work was sitting beside a little girl in a courtroom, offering his presence to a child who needed to know she wasn't alone. Understood that healing isn't just about prosecution or conviction, it's about connection. It's about one being recognizing the pain in another and saying, without words, 'I see you. I'm here, you're safe.'" Officer Mitchell looked at Emma. "Asked me to tell you that he's very proud to have been your friend." The audience erupted in applause. Then Emma was invited to the microphone. A special step stool had been provided so she could reach it comfortably. Sarah felt her heart racing as her daughter stepped forward, pressing against her leg. "Hi," Emma said, her voice clear and strong, amplified through the sound system to fill the auditorium. I'm Emma. 5 years ago, I was very scared. I was scared to talk about what happened to me, but helped me. Was my friend, and he helped me find my brave. She paused, stroking his head. A lot of kids are scared like I was. A lot of kids have things that happen to them that are bad and they don't know how to talk about it. I want to tell those kids that it's okay to be scared. But it's also okay to tell someone you trust what happened. And if you have a dog like to help you, that's really special. But even if you don't have a dog, you can find your brave inside yourself. You're stronger than you think. Emma looked out at the audience, her young face serious and contemplative. I'm not scared anymore, I'm happy. I go to school and I have friends and I like to read books and play soccer. I'm like a normal kid now. And that's because people helped me. Officer Mitchell helped me. My mommy and daddy helped me. And a lot of doctors and people who care about kids who got hurt. She looked back at, I want to say thank you too. You're the best dog ever. And thank you to everyone who helped me be brave. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. People were openly crying, hardened prosecutors, law enforcement officers, child advocates, and ordinary citizens who had come to witness this remarkable child. After the formal ceremony, there was a reception where Emma was introduced to people from across the country, representatives from the therapy dog programs in other states, prosecutors who had used similar approaches with their own child witnesses, parents of other survivors who wanted to express their gratitude for the systemic changes that Emma had catalyzed. One woman, probably in her 40s, approached Emma with tears streaming down her face. My daughter in a case 3 years ago, she said. She had a therapy dog with her just like you did. That dog saved my daughter. It gave her courage to speak. And it all started with you. I just wanted you to know you saved my daughter. Emma, with the emotional intelligence that trauma survivors sometimes develop, reached out and hugged this stranger, understanding without being told the depth of what this woman's gratitude represented. By evening, after the formal events concluded, the family was back at the police station with Officer Mitchell, and it had become their tradition. After any significant milestone or event, they would spend quiet time together, away from cameras and speeches and the public recognition that Emma's story had generated. Emma lay on the floor beside, her head resting on the dog's side, her fingers running through his graying fur. Officer Mitchell sat nearby, watching the connection between child and dog that had endured and deepened over 5 years. It's getting older, Emma said quietly, not as a question but as a simple observation. He is, Officer Mitchell confirmed. 11 is pretty old for a dog, but he's healthy and he's happy, and he still loves coming to work every day. When gets too old to work, Emma asked, her voice careful and deliberate, can he come live with us? Sarah and exchanged glances and nodded. It was a question they had anticipated, a question that seemed almost inevitable. I think that could be arranged, Officer Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. Would probably like that. He could spend his retirement years with his best friend. Emma smiled, understanding that she had just secured something precious, the continuation of a bond that had shaped her entire trajectory toward healing. Later that night, after they had returned home, Sarah found Emma sitting on her bed, drawing. The picture showed a small girl standing beside a large dog, with the sun shining brightly above them. At the bottom, in Emma's own increasingly sophisticated handwriting, were words that captured the entire journey. Help me find my brave. Now I help other kids find their brave too. It was a perfect encapsulation of Emma's transformation, from a traumatized child who couldn't speak, to a young girl who had found her voice, to a growing advocate for other survivors. The nightmare that had begun 5 years ago had metamorphosed into something extraordinary, a legacy of healing that extended far beyond one child, far beyond one courthouse, far beyond even one state. Across the nation, in courtrooms from coast to coast, therapy dogs were now sitting beside traumatized children, offering the same gift that had offered Emma. The knowledge that you are not alone, that your truth matters, that you have the strength to speak what needs to be spoken. Judge, now retired, would occasionally receive letters from families whose children had been helped by therapy dogs in courtrooms. She kept them in a file folder on her home office desk, reminders of the day when a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had entered her courtroom and fundamentally changed what justice could look like. The family had moved forward, but they carried with them the understanding that some connections transcend explanation. Emma and Had found each other at precisely the moment they needed each other most. And in that meeting of two souls, one human, one canine, both carrying trauma and the capacity for extraordinary resilience, they had created something that would reverberate through systems and lives for generations to come. The nightmare had become a beacon, the silence had become a voice, and the ordinary people who had stood beside Emma, her parents, her prosecutors, her doctors, and most extraordinarily, a remarkable German shepherd, had all played their part in proving that when a child is truly heard, truly supported, and truly believed, there are no limits to what she can accomplish. Emma had found her brave, and in doing so, she had given courage to countless others yet to speak their truth.